Well, good evening and welcome to the campus of Montgomery Bell Academy. I am Brad Joya. I teach English here, and I'm proud to be the headmaster here. And I'm very pleased to see all of you on this great evening. This collaboration with Ken Cheeseman and St. Paul Christian Academy and certainly the stars of the Trinity Forum has been a really wonderful sequence of events for us now. This is the second one. And we were discussing last night at a dinner how pleased we are that this has been so successful. This is sold out tonight. And with just the second event without a lot of planning, it makes us feel so good to see so many of you interested in this event. As some of you recall, Ron White was our initial speaker, the Abraham Lincoln Scholar, and we were really pleased to have him here in a year that Abraham Lincoln was very popular with all of us. We are pleased to have Os Guiness here, of course, and he spoke today to the St. Paul 6th grade, and he's going to speak tomorrow morning to a group of boys and dads here at MBA. And I think most of all, I was thinking about this, I was watching you upstairs, it is really special to see people enjoying an evening like this with some food and drink and camaraderie. And I think most of all, there's a hunger for some substantive ideas and conversation and thought. And we're proud to continue that, as you will hear from Cherie, who's going to follow me, I think. So please come on up and welcome everyone.
Thanks so much, Brad, and I just want to add my own welcome to this evening conversation with sociologist and author Os Guiness on Can Freedom Last Forever? Sustainable Freedom in the American Future. I'm Cherie Harder, the president of the Trinity Forum, and we are also just delighted to be partnering with Brad Joya and the Montgomery Bell Academy and Ken Cheeseman and St. Paul's Academy. It's been just a delight to be able to work with them and to be able to present what promises to be a fascinating conversation on the nature and the sustainability of freedom and what it means for us. We're also grateful to our hosts and sponsors who have made this evening possible. Joe and Judy Cook, who are here tonight, Matt and Betty Dobson, John and Carol Roachford, thank you so much, Ridley and Irene Wells, and last but certainly not least, someone who has done so much to make this evening possible, and that is Byron and Beth Smith. We're also just delighted that we have a sold-out crowd tonight, and while we're thrilled that each and every one of you are here, there's also a few special guests we'd just like to acknowledge from the outset, including Congressman Jim Cooper, Commissioner Bill Haggerty, the trustees of both MBA and St. Paul's, and our own trustees, our chairman of the board, Price Harding, Kathy Wills-Wright, Bob Kramer, and Academy trustee Gary and Marty Scudder. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Trinity Forum, we try to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do this by providing readings and other publications which draw upon the classic works of literature and the humanities in order to connect timeless wisdom with timely issues, as well as sponsoring programs like the one we're having tonight, which connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders to engage those big questions of life, and ultimately to come to better know the author of the answers. The great questions of the humanities relate to the purpose and the content of the good life and the good society, what it is, what it means, and how it's realized. And central to the American understanding of the good life and the just society is the ideal of freedom. But while Americans may largely agree on both the value and necessity of freedom, notions of what it is and how it's ordered and how it can be sustained are contested. And those contests form many of the major political and cultural battles of our time. In his recent book, A Free People's Suicide, Sustainable Freedom in the American Future, as well as his new release, The Global Public Square, Oz argues that the greatest challenge to freedom lies not in winning it or even ordering it, but in keeping it. And the greatest threats come not from hostile outside regimes, but from within, from an internal erosion of the civic character that's necessary to preserve freedom as we know it. And And so tonight, we'll get to consider together the provocative question, if it's true, as Oz will tell us, that the ultimate threat to the American public will be Americans themselves. And the problem is not wolves at the door, but termites in the floor. Then what can be done to sustain freedom? Certainly, it is both a challenging and a controversial topic, and few can address it with greater insight, expertise, or eloquence than our speaker this evening, Os Guinness. Oz is an author, a social critic, and I'm very proud to say the founder of the Trinity Forum. His scholarly work is certainly extensive, but he's also known firsthand over the course of his own life what it means when freedom is lost. The great-great-grandson of Arthur Guinness, the Dublin brewer, maybe there's a couple more greats in there, Oz was born in China in World War II, where his parents were medical missionaries. He was a witness to the climax of the Chinese Revolution, and in 1949 was expelled with other foreigners, eventually returned to Europe, where he was educated in England. He completed his undergraduate degree at Oxford and his DPhil in the social sciences from Oxford as well. After working as a freelance reporter for the BBC, Oz came to the United States to serve as a scholar with the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Studies, and later as a fellow at the Brookings Institution. He went on to serve as the executive director for the Williamsburg Charter Foundation, a bicentennial celebration of the First Amendment, and then to become both a founder and a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. In his ample free time, Oz has written more than 25 books, including The American Hour, Time for Truth, The Call, one of my favorites, Invitation to the Classics, Long Journey Home, Unspeakable, his newest, The Global Public Square, and of course, most pertinent to our discussion tonight, A Free People's Suicide, Sustainable Freedom and the American Future. Oz, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be here, although daunting. You only need to enter this building and you've got all of Aristotle's outline, outside, inside, for you to have a crib sheet in critiquing any speaker from this podium. So it's an extraordinary experience to look around and see the things. Reason, logic, rhetoric, help. Okay. People often wonder why I, as an Englishman, am interested in things American. And there are many answers to that. But one of the answers I give is a story about Winston Churchill. There was a time he was visiting Williamsburg as Prime Minister. And the guide was waxing eloquent about the revolution against the English. And then sort of remembered who she was talking to. Churchill snorted. "Nay," he said. "It wasn't a revolution against the English. They were Englishmen with English ideas fighting a German king with his German mercenaries." And many of us who are English feel that, although with a certain rueful poignancy, we acknowledge that ideas which were sown in England very often flowered here in a way that they never did back in England. So I've long been a great admirer of this country. Anybody who thinks of the West has to think of a Western commitment to freedom. One thinks of Leonidas holding the pass at Thermopylae, or the Greeks fighting at Salamis. Why? Freedom. You read the story of the assassins of Julius Caesar, with their daggers still dripping with blood, going out into the forum crying, "Libertas, libertas." And you can see from Magna Carta down through the American Revolution and the French Revolution, the cry of freedom has been a recurring cry. In the 19th century, one of the great French liberals, de Tocqueville, he says, human societies and human individuals are nothing if not what they do with freedom. And of course, if you think that ties in with the great St. Augustine, who remarks of nations, you don't understand them by the size of their population or the strength of their armies and things like that. You look at what he called the loved things held in common those things that a nation loves supremely, if that's noble, the nation may be noble. If that's in healthy condition, the nation may be in healthy condition. And anyone looking at America, of course, the supreme love down the centuries is freedom. And that ties in, of course, with what Cherie said, that in many ways the most brilliant and daring thing your founders did at all was to believe that they could build a free republic that could stay free forever. But freedom had never lasted. And the question is, do we understand why they thought that was possible? Do we understand the systems they thought that were needed to make that feasible? And how is America doing today, 2 1/3 centuries, in terms of cultivating still sustainable freedom? So that's the topic for the evening. And forgive it from an Englishman. Let me set out a number of propositions to you, finishing with some of the challenges that we face today. First, understand the tasks the framers knew they were tackling in building this republic. They were very aware that there were 3 tasks, not just one. And as Cherie said simply, they are winning freedom, ordering freedom, and the third one, sustaining freedom. Winning freedom, of course, is the Revolution, 1776. Glorious, and obviously celebrated much, and especially on July the 4th, but in many ways the easiest of the 3. The French did it. The Russians did it. The Chinese did it. I witnessed the climax of the Chinese Revolution. Many nations have had revolutions that threw off some ancien regime or another, and they won their freedom against the establishment. But the second challenge is harder. Ordering freedom. Giving freedom a moral, political framework, legal framework, within which it can truly flourish. And that, of course, is not the revolution, the Constitution. And in many ways, that took much, much more thought and work. And the French did not do it. And the Russians did not do it. And the Chinese did not do it. In fact, all 3 of those revolutions spiraled down to demonic disorder and often produced tyrannies worse than the tyranny they fought against. But the genius of this country was the ordering of freedom. It was a tempered liberty. But many Americans forget the third part, sustaining freedom. And you can see the irony there, because the word sustainable is a vogue word today. Everything has to be sustainable. Sustainable environment, sustainable development, sustainable capitalism, you name it. But how many discuss sustainable freedom the way that the framers did? In other words, they were aware that freedom does not last. You remember the famous incident when Benjamin Franklin came out of the Constitutional Convention. Secret, of course. And Mrs. Powell came up to him and said, "What did you achieve, Mr. Franklin?" And his famous reply, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And you can see that many of the founders, as they got older, they used the word perpetuating, seeing that our institutions go on and on and on. You can see the young Lincoln when he gave his famous speech at the Lyceum in Springfield. 28 years old, only a few months in Springfield, asked what topic he'd like to address for the day. As a 28-year-old, he chose the topic, the perpetuation of our institutions. And like an historian crossed with an accountant, he talks of America's accounts running and looks at the good side and the bad side and tots them all up in terms of how America's doing 50 years on in terms of the perpetuation of the institutions. I've lived in Washington 29 years now, at the end of this month. I have never heard a single American statesman address American renewal. There have been some writers like John Gardner and his book on that, but almost nobody, as if there's a power here and a freedom here and a permanence here that will go on forever. Many of you must have been to Rome. The framers, of course, admired Rome more than the Greeks. We British admired the Greeks. But you go to Capitol Hill, and that sense of strength and permanence is everywhere. The statuary, the quotations, the symbols, everywhere. There's nothing that suggests this cannot go on for another 10,000 years. You go to Rome itself and look out at Capitol Hill in Rome, and you see the vestiges of the Roman kings. And then the fall of the Roman Republic. And then the Caesarian monarchy. And then the military dictatorships. And they're all there in your eyes with the ruins that you can see so easily. And not surprisingly, Europe has a much greater sense of what Polybius calls the wheel of history turning and nothing lasting forever. But the framers believed deeply, winning, ordering, and sustaining. Secondly, think of their understanding of the menaces that faced them as they tried to do that. They were revolutionary. But many Americans forget they were also rooted. Like your good graduates from here, they knew their history. They ransacked history, and you look at the books of classics that they read. They're amazing compared with people today. And they knew the lessons of why no system, not just democracy, why no system lasted, certainly no free society. And there were three basic reasons you can see above all in Cicero and Polybius. The first one, they hardly bothered about. It was external menaces. In other words, a nation suddenly finds itself with a nation larger, better armed or whatever outside itself, and it's in trouble. And for obvious reasons, that wasn't their primary problem. They had come from a small protected island, almost all of them, and now they're on an essentially large protected continent, and the nearest serious enemies were 3,000 miles away. And that notion of external enemies wasn't at the paramount level of their thinking. So you read George Washington's farewell address, and he doesn't take that terribly seriously. Or you read the speech I mentioned by Lincoln. He almost disdains the idea of what he calls a transatlantic Bonaparte putting his feet down in the cornfields of Ohio. Impossible, unthinkable. But of course for us today, not so. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, 19 gentlemen with box cutters, and we know that an external menace we take seriously much more than they did. But the two that they took seriously, we don't. And the second one is what Polybius calls a corruption of customs. Polybius, as you probably know, is the historian who follows some of his earlier Greek heroes, like Aristotle, and outlines all the different forms of government, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, and their corrupt forms, and discusses how they rise and fall as the wheel turns. But as he looks at how freedom doesn't last, he talks about the importance of a corruption of customs. Polybius argues that what's decisive for any system is its constitution, the fundamental laws of the nation. But Americans read that and almost go to sleep. You've got the greatest, longest surviving constitution in the world. What more do you need? But Polybius goes on. He says the best constitution in the world rests in a bedding of moral standards, of traditions, of customs. And if that is corrupted, the constitution will be subverted. The same in name, but no longer in reality. And the framers understood that very clearly. But the third menace is the one they knew nothing could be done about, and no one has found a solution to. In one word, time. And you can see the extraordinary sense of time they had, that while they were aware of this as the first new nation and all that was progressive and new, they were also incredibly aware of the passing of time. You probably know the Constitution was passed the same year that Edward Gibbon wrote the last volume of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And in the last chapter, Gibbon raises the question, why did Rome fall? He describes it as a fall beyond belief. Why did it fall? And his first answer, the injuries of time. Cicero, long before him, had talked about the fading of a republic and how, like a painting, ideas that are fresh become faded. Ideas that are revolutionary become routine. And eventually, the injuries of time, and nothing stays the same. And Lincoln, I think, is remarkable as a 28-year-old. I know my son is early 30s, no great sense of the passing of time. But if you read that speech by Lincoln, you can see he talks about the silent artillery of time doing to the ramparts of the republic what no enemy could possibly do. Time. So they were deeply aware of those challenges, and the system, of course, was built to resist those. And the question is, what was it? But let me break into their discussion by adding a much more modern perspective, thirdly. And that is, we need to grapple with the paradox of freedom. People say a rose is a rose is a rose, Gertrude Stein, and many think that freedom is as easy as that. Freedom is freedom is freedom. But it's not. And anyone knows the story of freedom, the greatest enemy of freedom is freedom. And if you look at what freedom is and how it undermines itself, you come to grips with this paradox of freedom, which every generation needs to wrestle with. The obvious level of that is just looking at the history of freedom. You look at all the free societies, very, very few, and relatively fleeting. As one historian says, if you compress 100 centuries of civilization into 1 hour, free societies only come in the last 5 minutes. And as many historians have said, they are a fragile flower. But deeper than that is the political part of the conundrum. As the great French philosopher Montesquieu points out, freedom doesn't just rely on structures. It relies on the spirit of freedom. In other words, you can have the best structures in the world, constitutions, laws, all those built into place solidly. But if you don't have the spirit of freedom, freedom will not last. Now, of course, the structures can be laid down, and they will last. But the spirit of freedom has to be kept alive from generation to generation. So it's always one generation away from failing. But underneath that is the moral challenge of the paradox of freedom, which put simply is this: freedom requires a framework. It requires some restraint. But there's only one type of restraint that's appropriate to freedom, and that is self-restraint, if someone's to remain free. But self-restraint is precisely what's undermined when freedom flourishes. And so freedom never has ever lasted. How does it decline? Well, sometimes it slips into a permissiveness that becomes license and anarchy. Sometimes freedom is so wonderful that people want to be safe in their freedom and build so much security keeping them safe that they no longer have freedom. Think of the bumper sticker, "One nation under surveillance." And the third paradox is that sometimes freedom is so precious that people will fight for it anyway, including ways that contradict freedom, and they undermine themselves. Think of Abu Ghraib. The paradox of freedom is something we need to wrestle with carefully. How do we think that we can defy the odds of history and still sustain freedom? But let me move fourthly to the framers' antidotes to that decline, and what I think is their way of understanding how freedom can be sustained. They didn't give a name for it. Tocqueville calls it the habits of the heart, which are more important to American freedom, he says, than American laws. Now, you know, the framers had wrestled with the whole history of the understanding of political systems and free societies. The Greeks thought you did it by virtue. Of course, Machiavelli turns that on his head and goes to his super cynical realism. Jefferson, interestingly, is out of step with many of the framers at this point, and while he's the champion of many liberals today, he's actually closer to the Greeks in thinking that virtue alone could sustain freedom, although the virtue he was talking about was a farmer's virtue of people who are living on the land. But the rest of the framers, Madison, Hamilton, and the others, had a rather different view. And you can see what I call the golden triangle of freedom. They didn't call it that. But in many of their writings and in many of their speeches, they stress three things which are interlocking, rather like the three legs of a triangle. The first leg, freedom, requires virtue. John Adams says, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. Now, of course, virtue to them was not just goody-goody, as it is to many people today. It was a one-word summary from everything from honesty, loyalty, patriotism, including character. And I love particularly Adams' references to these. They loved words like inalienable, indefeasible, and these sort of things. And usually when they use those words, they roll them off in terms of freedom and rights. But there's a wonderful passage in Adam where he talks about the people's indefeasible, inalienable. He rolls off the adjectives. What he's talking about is their right to know the character of their leaders. Why? Because in the framers' understanding, between followers and leaders, the character of the leader was the bridge. You could trust a leader, even in the dark. You didn't know why they were making certain decisions, if you knew their character. And of course, character was the inner bearings for the leader, who often in situations where there was nothing else to restrain him or her, still had the character that provided that restraint. Freedom requires virtue. Now, very easy to see how that one's completely rejected today. Take character. I remember when the Clinton impeachment was going forward, there's a letter in the New York Times from a number of American scholars who virtually said, the president's character doesn't matter. What matters in a president is competence. They almost said he could have the morals of an alley cat so long as he had the competence of a political leader. And you can see how far they were from the founders. And you can see too how virtue at large is profoundly rejected today. Freedom requires virtue. Second leg of the triangle, virtue requires faith of some sort. Of course, there's no established faith in this country. There's no orthodoxy. There's no formal faith for America. But they were very aware that if you ask what provides the inspiration to virtue, what provides the content of saying what virtue is, so it's not an empty word, and also what provides the sanction for people who are not virtuous, there's nothing like faith to do that. So, for example, take Adams. He was very clear that atheists had every right to freedom of conscience, of course, but he's extremely chary about the idea of a society of atheists because of the inability to ground a strong sense of virtue. Virtue requires faith of some sort. And the third leg of the triangle, faith of any sort requires freedom. And as you know, that's the genius of the First Amendment. You ask many Americans what's the most distinctive, the unique part of the American experiment, people will say to me, separation of powers. Oh, the Swiss had that centuries before this country. Montesquieu wrote about that long earlier to this country. But what is absolutely unique is the First Amendment. The disestablishment of religion, but not the exclusion of faith in public life. An institutional disestablishment, but not a disestablishment of ideas. And you can see that faiths of all kinds have flourished in this country, not despite disestablishment, but because of it. Because faith for everyone is voluntary and based on the dictates of conscience. Now let me jump from their solution, and to me it's sad how few Americans discuss sustainability or discuss their understanding of how the framers thought you could sustain freedom. And if you look in history, people have tried it in various ways, but I personally know no audacious system like the framers for thinking you could sustain freedom, possibly forever. Hardly any Americans bother with the issue. And in other talks I'd say more about the time in between and what's got us to where we are today. But let me jump to some of the menaces we face to freedom today, the contemporary menaces. One is simply the alienation of leaders. It's partly neglect. Many leaders don't know American history. Sometimes it's disagreement and open assault. And there are many people who think any notion like this is an Americanism that's coercive, rather like the melting pot, and we've got to scrap all that sort of notion. But you can see today a significant number of Americans' thought leaders have no interest and no knowledge of the framers' understanding of how you sustain freedom. And quite clearly, no nation survives if a significant number of its leaders are at odds with whatever made it great. A second contemporary menace, equally obvious to me, is the breakdown in the transmission of values. If you think of your republic, America is in the business of transmitting values in every generation in two ways. And if it ever stops, the country's in trouble. One way is from the older generation to the younger generation. We call that education. You think of the mediocrity of public education, and certainly any notion of civic education ever since the 1960s. I was reading just this afternoon a report on the common reading that more than 300 universities have asked their students to do this year, what they've asked all their students to do. And out of more than 300 universities, only 8 required a book that was earlier than 1990. And there are almost no classics in the list at all. An incredible breakdown in the transmission from generation to generation. The other area of transmission is the breakdown from the old-timers to the newcomers, immigration. Now, we all know immigration is a hot topic at the moment. But again, living in Washington, I've heard discussed the border controls, English as a second language, economic, this, that, and the other. I've never heard a single person mention civic education. But how is it when people come, they know what it is to be American? As one scholar puts the problem, it's relatively easy to become an American in terms of naturalization papers, but it's increasingly difficult to know what it is to be American. Or you take your wonderful motto, e pluribus unum, which by many in the world is reckoned to be your greatest achievement, not just your motto. Out of many, one. But if ever you fail to teach what is the one, you'll have an exploding pluribus, diversity, without any unity. And clearly that's what's happening, and the balkanization of America proceeds apace. There's a simple breakdown in the transmission of American values. And the third contemporary menace is the undermining of the very notion of freedom. Freedom is so simple and yet so challenging. How would I define freedom? Simply, the capacity for self-determination. Now, if you think of that, freedom is a means, it's not a goal, it's not an end. Freedom has its own goals, human flourishing, the fulfillment of human dignity, freedom for personal responsibility, or whatever it is. Freedom is not the end. Freedom is the means to live what Cherie reminded us is the good life for the good society. And yet you can see today we've had a strong corruption of the very notion of freedom. So the framers understood, to put it in modern philosophical terms, freedom was both negative and positive. Negative freedom is freedom from, and that's foundational freedom. Freedom from whatever oppresses you. Colonial power, an addiction, chains, or whatever. Freedom from is essential and foundational. But negative freedom has to lead to positive freedom. Freedom for, freedom to be. But in order to know what we're here for and what we're free to be, we need to have truth to tell us that. And you can see today freedom has just become negative. It's all freedom from. And you can see the wiles of libertarian freedom are a very, very different freedom than the freedom of the framers. And it's quite clear they are unsustainable. Now I want to finish with a more challenge. When my book came out last summer, I came back from Europe, and my wife and I were invited into the Congress. And a veteran who'd been there 30 years invited us into his office. He shook my hands and he said, "I like your book. I've got one quarrel. It's too optimistic." And he argued for the next 2 hours that America didn't have 5 years before some of the problems would be irreversible. I don't think I'm a Pollyanna. So let me, in a way I didn't put in the book, finish by talking of some of the confusions and corruptions surrounding freedom today. First, there's an unfortunate confusion with freedom and democracy. Think of, say, President George W. Bush's second inaugural, where he mentioned those words more than 70 times. Now, anyone who knows the history of freedom, democracy has to be looked at very carefully because it often undermines freedom. Many of the greatest thinkers in the Western history warned that democracy issued eventually into tyranny. Now, Plato and Aristotle said it quite bluntly. But many of the greatest thinkers of the 19th century, including Tocqueville and many others, warned that that was the outcome of democracy. And if you look at the history of democracy, democracy brought in the death of Socrates. It wasn't the oligarchs, it was the Democrats. It was French revolutionary democracy which brought in Napoleon. Hitler, of course, as we know, was voted in by 51.4% of the people. And anyone who understands the history of democracy, it is not always the best friend of freedom. And we have to examine where democracy is at any moment to really see how it's doing in terms of favoring freedom or undermining freedom today. The second confusion and corruption is another old one, but it's rearing its head in America now, which is the confusion of liberty and equality. They're both terribly important, but they're in open competition always, and often in strong contradiction. Too much untrammeled liberty, and you can have incredible inequalities, which will undermine liberty. But the story of freedom is that when you put equality above liberty, you lose in the long run both. The fact is, of course, that all equality is artificial. We humans are not equal. Some are faster, stronger, more brilliant, better business people, or whatever. We humans are simply not equal. Equal under God, equal under law, but we are not equal. And the confusion of equality of opportunity with equality of outcome is disastrous. But worse than that, equality is always appealing to envy, and Tocqueville warns of this very strongly. And so equality always brings in a leveling effect. So the strong and the best are brought down, and you have a level society of mediocrity. And of course, the third problem of equality is that when you enforce it, because it's artificial, and you want to level it down, someone has to be the umpire, and of course in today's world, that's the state. And so the umpiring state gets stronger and stronger and eventually kills the freedom. Now that's incredibly important today, because in the name of the extremes of the sexual revolution, you can see non-discrimination in an egalitarian way, and there was an example last week in New Mexico, is strongly undermining human rights and liberty. But the third modern challenge, corruption, confusion, is the problem of information. As they discussed republics in the past, the traditional understanding was not necessarily right, America could contradict it, but the traditional understanding was that democracies were very small. Athens, the city-state. Republics, like Genoa and so on, were medium-sized. But when you had large countries, like, say, the Empire of Persia, they were monarchical. And the very size mattered. And you can see the framers wrestling with this. They were not only trying to create a lasting republic, they were trying to say, could it be a republic with democratic freedom that was a large republic? Now, of course, it's not Athens, so the idea of direct democracy, the 6,000 men in Athens voting, was impossible. It was indirect democracy. It was representative democracy. But of course, as the number of people in a democracy grow, and India, of course, is over 1 billion today, what does that mean? Well, you can see in the 19th century, presidents said, we answer this, universal suffrage, with universal education. But as people warned then, and you can see now, universal education often leads to a debased education. And now think of the impact of the social media. Obviously many good sides. The activity, the interactivity, the shift from the few speaking to the many speaking to the many. We can pile up the pros, but think of the cons. We're in a world with exploding information, accelerating events, and you can see this growing gap between the elites that we have to trust in more and more areas, and most people just not really thinking, but emoting. How many blogs have at the bottom, like, dislike? Purely emotional category. And the question comes, are we having the government of the consent of the governed? Are they really wise enough to make the decisions that are necessary in a democracy? And you can see, if you follow many of these things, the American Republic at the moment is facing some challenges that over the next 20, 30, 50 years will go to the root of whether freedom can truly survive. I'm not a pessimist. There are things that can be done now. For example, I mentioned civic education. I shouldn't need to say that here. You have magnificent education here. But if everywhere was like MBA, America would be not in trouble. But it would be relatively easy for a national leader to address the absence of civic education and call for a movement that put it back in the heart of America again. A second area, which would be harder to address, is the reopening of the public square. Because you can see how 50 years of culture warring, more and more, you see on the one side certain religious people considered extremists, and on the other side certain secularists and separationists who'd like to get the whole business out. And that freedom of the diversity in the public square is slowly freezing over in ways that are fateful. Europe, you think of as very secular. But interestingly, the best voices speaking against the strict separationism and the secularity of a naked public square come from Europe. And you have atheists like Jürgen Habermas in Germany, who argues that unless every voice and every religious voice is included in public life, liberalism will be illiberal. But at many points, American liberalism is not 19th century liberalism, but a highly illiberal liberalism that is undermining freedom. Those of us who are people of faith have to say that the third area we need to tackle is the renewal of faith. I'm not addressing that tonight, but you can see that much of the church and many other religions in America have become in captivity to the modern world and are not really having the integrity and effectiveness that's needed to play the role that they do. But why am I not a pessimist? The framers had a wonderful way of putting this. They understood the parallels between the Jews and the Puritans and what they were doing in the Revolution. And they saw three parallels. The first two don't really concern us, but I'll mention them. What the Jews talked of as Exodus, the Puritans talked of as conversion. And the framers talked of, with their political national understanding, as revolution. In other words, a liberating experience which freed a people. The second parallel they saw was what the Jews saw as covenant, the Puritans also saw as covenant, and they, with their political national understanding, saw as constitution. In other words, that free, voluntary, binding assent to this system under God. And as you know, the Constitution owes everything to the Reformation and earlier the biblical notion of covenant. But it's the third parallel that's always intrigued me. What the Jews spoke of as a return. That word is so common in English. Many people who read, say, the Old Testament hardly notice it. But it's a common reference in the prophets. Israel has turned from God to idols, and they turn back from the false gods to God, and God turns back to them. And they call it in one word, return. What the Jews called return, the Puritans called revival. And the framers had their own version of that, national and political. One who was much more conservative, like George Mason, talks about the need for a frequent recurrence to fundamental first principles. We need to keep going back to the founding principles. Thomas Jefferson, you know, much more liberal, he talked about the need for a revolution every 20 years. As Tocqueville said, every generation is a new people, and every generation has to buy into it all over again, or the generation arises who don't know it, and then the whole system and freedom is in trouble. So is it possible? Of course. My friend, the congressman, his deepest sense of the problem was lack of leadership. Statesman-like, Lincoln-like leadership addressing the problem. You could pick your own ones. But there's no reason why it couldn't happen again. And I'll finish with a thought from de Tocqueville that you can think over. He, of course, wrote Democracy in America, which Americans love, because he praises American democracy, but he didn't write it for Americans. He wrote it for Frenchmen. He wrote it to try and affect his own country, and he was a disappointed lover in the French Revolution. And all his life, he compares the two revolutions, and he's not starry-eyed about the American. His predictions are uncannily prescient of where we are today, with a rampant individualism and what he calls a tutelary state. So rather like a horseshoe with its extremes meeting at the extreme, you can see that democracy is producing something that is against freedom. He wasn't uncritical, in other words. But towards the end of his life, when he's comparing the French and the American revolutions, he made this little remark. With a revolution, as with a novel, the hard part to invent is the ending. Your founding fathers were not perfect. Think of slavery. But in many areas, they wrote a brilliant, brilliant first chapter. And many would argue no nation has had so many brilliant, far-sighted visionaries all in the same generation. There have, of course, been great generations since then. But there's no question that the next generation is one that will probably be absolutely critical to America. Can freedom last forever? the next generation may cast the casting vote. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Guinness, for your clarity in helping us think through this paradoxical idea of freedom. I'm Ken Cheeseman, and I'm the headmaster at St. Paul Christian Academy, one of our 3 sponsoring institutions for this evening's conversation. And it was my good pleasure to host Dr. Guinness on our campus this afternoon as he addressed our 57 sixth graders. While I think he was a bit curious about how he might approach 11 and 12-year-olds, I think he met them at their level quite well in discussing religious freedom, a heady topic for that age group, to be sure. He captivated their attention early, 1, with his accent, and 2, with the revelation that his family started the Guinness Book of World Records. I don't think the beer thing really touched them very much, but I think I'm thankful for that. But thank you again for giving our students pause this afternoon, Dr. Guinness, to think more deeply about the way forward in creating the kind of culture that allows religious freedom and freedom for all. Well, my job tonight is to kick off the question and answer period. So if you would like to come forward and ask a question of Dr. Guinness, please come forward and speak into the mic so that we can capture audio of your question. And I get to lob the first question. So my question is this. For those of us who are blessed to work with children and adolescents, what are the 1 or 2 habits or 1 or 2 habits of mind we ought to enforce most with our children while they are young that will best prepare them to embrace the kind of freedom you've challenged us to think about tonight?
I have 1 son. I'm not a school teacher, so the odd thing is that you, Ken, and you, Brad, could answer that 1,000,000 times better than I could. But I'm thinking of relatively simple things, like the importance of character and virtue and all the things I saw. I mean, I haven't seen an American class of 11-year-olds with such respect and courtesy, as well as eagerness to jump into the discussions. I saw that you're obviously doing it, so I'm not sure I could add to anything you and Brad are obviously doing so magnificently. I mean, if every school was like these 2 schools, the country would be in great shape.
My name is Joseph Williams. I'm a current 3L at Vanderbilt Law School right down the street. My question for you concerns how we frame a lot of what you talked about tonight in the ongoing public square and the debate that's happening there. Because in my mind, and I taught U.S. history at an inner city high school here for a couple years before going back to law school, and a lot of the debate seems to struggle because look no further than our current president's second inaugural address, in which he cast a lot of things which many of us would feel infringe upon religious liberty and our first freedoms and a lot of the basics that you talked about tonight. But it's cast through a historical lens that reaches all the way back to our founders and our framers. And so it's not so much that currently in the public square no one is talking about these freedoms, but often our opponents who we're talking to, who are good freedom-loving Americans sometimes, but not as much as we'd like, a lot of times they're casting it through a historical lens which is calling to Lincoln and Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton and Washington and Adams. And so we're talking about the same people, we're talking about the same principles, and yet that's where the debate is. And so what would your advice be about how to engage them in that?
Mm-hmm. We could talk about Vanderbilt. in its decisions. We could talk about the University of California, which in the last month has followed Vanderbilt. We could talk about the New Mexico, or we could talk about the administration. Often there's an appalling ignorance of human rights and notions like religious freedom. So if you take the three core freedoms, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, there's no hierarchy, they're right about that, but they're interlocking, and the deepest of them all that the others assume and require is freedom of conscience. So if you take the current administration, for the first 2 years, they talked about freedom of worship. That is not religious freedom. Every dictator gives freedom of worship. Whatever people think between their ears with their mouths shut, they're free to think. Well, that is not freedom. And for the framers, Madison's term free exercise, the right to reach, hold, exercise, share, and change your beliefs. All of those. So religious freedom is rather like a musical accordion. You can say freedom of religion. But actually, like an accordion, to get the full music, you have to look at all the different parts there are. Now, they went from that very bad defense of freedom of worship to great speeches. Probably no American leader has made a better speech than Hillary Clinton on religious freedom. Bill Clinton, of course, is a Southern Baptist, a teenager, if you scratch him. He made some pretty good speeches himself as president, but her speech was stunning. But they didn't walk the talk. And then came the healthcare mandates, which are a direct violation of religious freedom of the Catholic Church and others. But now, for instance, the New Mexico decision, they talked about doing that in the name of citizenship. Well, I didn't know who the judge was. That is plain ignorance. A human right is a right because it's inherent in humanity. Everyone as a human being has that right as a matter of belonging at birth. A civil right is a right because a society so deems that they will accept that right. So a human right is a civil right automatically. Civil right is not automatically a human right. And if ever they clash, the human right, in this case religious freedom, always trumps the civil right. And the idea that in the name of citizenship, which they mean non-discrimination, which they mean the sexual revolution, etc., that is a total ignorance of the history of religious freedom and of America's great tradition. So for me, it's tragic. Madison called the American way the true remedy. And most people would say the American way is the most nearly perfect solution the world's ever seen. Nearly perfect. We've egregious violations, the Philadelphia riots, the anti-Semitism, but put them all on one side. The framers got race wrong from the beginning. They got religious freedom almost nearly right from the beginning. The world's never seen anything better. But the last 50 years, and particularly in this administration, America is in danger not only of failing the world, because this is a global issue and America has no leadership, but of squandering her own heritage. And part of it's out of ignorance. I mean, I've heard the president in the White House discussing some of these things. I wish it had been a situation where one could talk freely, but he's frankly ignorant of the issue. And of course, he's surrounded by people even more ignorant. Like the lady from Georgetown University with her zero-sum game and so on.
Dr. Guinness, thank you for this evening. I'm Claude Presnell. I work with 34 independent colleges and universities here in the state of Tennessee. You've made some pretty alarming remarks about higher education as a whole, and many of which I think I would share. We're in the midst of a higher education reform in the United States, in Tennessee, but throughout our nation, that really has the educational institutions focusing on efficiency and economic good. And not that that's bad, but it seems to be the entire reform discussion does not include civil discourse or civil society. So what do you see the role of higher education in sustaining freedom in this nation?
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, the best of Western higher education, from Plato's Academy, right down to the founding of the modern universities like the Sorbonne, Oxford, Cambridge, and Harvard, and so on, is in line with what Cherie mentioned at the beginning, the good life and the good society, which required a full understanding of things, including virtue. But you can see a double pressure against that. On the one hand, which you mentioned, the drive to succeed. So many of the foundations, they want mathematical geniuses and so on, not the slightest bit interested in the classics. But then again, another pressure comes from the rise of the dominance of a secular atheism, which views everything within the narrow confines of a scientific worldview, and everything else is unreal. And so again, notions like virtue or the good life are irrelevant to them too. But that's disastrous in the long run. And I'm sure, again, you teach your people, I imagine when they leave MBA, they desire and demand something that the average place wouldn't give them, and they look for it. I hope so. And I was talking to my son last weekend. He was home, and I signed the first of my current books to him. It's dedicated to him. And I said, do you want some for some of your friends, who read things? And he said, well, Daddy, he said, well, one friend is a computer geek and he reads everything in the high-tech area. Another friend is in this and he reads a lot, but only in that area. He said, to be honest, I only have one friend who reads voraciously in every area. Oh, my goodness. I mean, obviously here, but certainly I was privileged to go to a school where Latin, Greek, Roman history, Plato, Aristotle. My headmaster, I often say I can think of him as a 12-year-old. In those days, they wore mortarboards when they taught in England and wore the academic gown. And he was a friend of Winston Churchill's. He'd twiddle his gown. He'd talk about Pericles with a living way as if he knew Pericles the way he knew Churchill, but it came alive. And I've loved it ever since. It's just as natural as breathing. But I find in parts of America now people just haven't a clue. So I think both of those things we have to resist. I'm not for a minute against success in business and mathematics and all those good things, or against science properly understood. But the idea that those things should drive out the other areas leaves us all less fully rounded as humans.
Thank you again, Dr. Guinness. I was wondering, as a person who works with students, I was going to follow up with the St. Paul, who's there with the Academy, and just kind of ask you, if Lord Acton was right with true freedom being one that's not just the ability to do whatever one wants, but actually the power to do what one ought to do. What was one of the biggest, focuses of your speech to them as you engaged with sixth graders? I know that's a challenge, at least it is for me. So I can just imagine for you, what's kind of the main driving point that you hit home with them and something that we could learn from as well?
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't. It was religious freedom, not freedom, this afternoon. And I made some very, very simple points. The two essential problems, state oppression, sectarian violence, and the two false answers, a sacred public square where one religion predominates and makes everyone else second class or worse, and the naked public square where you exclude all religion, and then argued for a better way. But let me answer Ken a little more this time. Everything you do, wonderful, it goes without saying. But with my son, I've always tried to keep him ahead of the game. In other words, not just give him all the good things we mentioned, but keep him ahead of the game. For example, forgive me, as a European, horrified by consumer advertising and its effects on all sorts of things, including thinking. So when my son was 8, we had a little game called Spot the Lie. I would give him a quarter every time he could look at a commercial or an ad, wherever it was, and tell me what was irrational, the non sequitur, the specious claim, etc. And we called the game off, or he was getting too much. But it gave him a canny sense of just looking through this stuff and not just accepting it as self-evident and normal. Because many of the things that are happening are plain crazy. And people are going on with them because they're the latest, greatest, or whatever. And we've got to get our kids, it's not just the good things we put into them, but keeping them ahead of the game. You're going to university, you'll face this, that, and the other. Not with fear, but a sense this is what you'll face, you've got to think it through ahead, and so on. My son doesn't like to take things from me, but he went to University of Virginia, where Ken also went, great university, and I don't think he'd ever listened to any of my talks on truth and postmodernism, let alone read a book. But the first week, UVA phoned me with great excitement. 12:30, I was asleep in bed. He said, "Daddy, I took on the anthropology professor who said there's no truth and everything's relative. And what do you think of my arguments?" And I was amazed how much he'd got, but we had tried to keep him ahead of the game. So as well as the good positive things, I would say, we who are older, been around the track, you can see some of the craziness. One thing that a lot of kids are now beginning to understand is, say, cell phones and the lack of really interpersonal communication. And the little video that's flashing around, seen 15 million times, with people just on cell phones. We need to drive home these things to make them think. In other words, what is not self-evident, and it may not be what should be. And we've got to keep them ahead of the game. Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here. I have kind of two parts. One is, I'm aware of the New Mexico ruling, but I suspect there's some in the room that are not. So could you just tell...
I couldn't describe in detail. I've just seen references, and I haven't followed it up.
Well, basically, the New Mexico Supreme Court told a business who said because of their religious beliefs, they did not want to provide a wedding cake to a gay wedding. They were brought up on charges, and the state Supreme Court ruled against the couple, saying you do not have the right to use your religious beliefs to determine how you will act in your business.
And specifically said that their rights had to be subservient to citizenship.
To citizenship. That is exactly right.
It's a human right subservient to a civil right.
That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about that triangle, I believe you said virtue and freedom and faith were the three pieces of that triangle, if I'm correct. I hope
Freedom requires virtue.
Right.
Virtue requires faith of some sort. Faith of any sort requires freedom. And like the recycling triangle, it goes round.
And so my question was, you mentioned our religious institutions, and that one of the problems in society is they're really not fulfilling their function. So could you speak a minute about, from your view, what should our religious organizations be doing more in the public arena to help remedy that part of the problem?
Mm-hmm. But I should start by saying the problem isn't just the public arena. The problem is the private arena too. There's an immense amount of work showing how religions of all sorts, including the Christian faith, have been shaped more by the advanced modern world than by their own imperatives. And you can mention some simple examples. One would be fragmentation. The Jewish, the Christian, and the Muslim faiths, they're all Abrahamic. They have one common link. They all require integration. Jews integrate their lives under the Torah. Christians under the Lordship of Jesus. Muslims under the Quran or the Sharia. But the modern world doesn't allow that. The force is what's called differentiation. The modern world throws up all sorts of different spheres of life, so the tendency is for faith to be fragmented. You're one thing here, one thing there, and so on. And faith loses that binding integration which is so strong. And that's disastrous for the Christian faith. Or another example is the way the modern world, for different reasons, shifts us from authority in faith to preference. Probably the main factor here is consumerism. You think of a supermarket, there's 100 cereals. There's no right cereal, it's just what you choose. But that sense of choice comes into everything. Marriages, faiths, it's the church of your choice. So our Catholic friends, you take, say, the last 3 elections, they've raised questions about Catholic politicians who personally were pro-life, maybe, but publicly were pro-choice. And the church considered withholding the sacraments because they simply weren't obeying. What Karl Barth called the binding address of faith. Belief binds behavior. Gone. Everything's preference. You move to evangelicalism. Evangelicalism has never had higher, sharper, clearer views of the authority of the Bible. Never. The Reformers didn't talk about inerrancy. We have all sorts of things, higher, sharper, clearer than ever. But evangelical behavior on the ground, almost anything is done by some evangelical in the name of Christian freedom. In other words, there's a total breakdown of authority in practice. Everything's shifted from authority to preference. And those are just examples. So the problem is actually in us before we enter the public square. Now, I would just say one thing. When we do enter the public square, we should fight for a vision of public life that allows everyone, not just us. And a great mistake of conservatives, they fought for the violations against us. No, we should fight for the common good and for everybody's rights. Rights are best protected when the tiniest minority is protected and the most unpopular group is protected. We may dislike what they believe, but we've got to guard their rights. So we fight for the common good. Secondly, in the public square, we need to be persuasive. Too many Christians have preached, protested, picketed, whatever, but persuaded, no. So we argue for life, to atheists or whatever it is. We need to put it in their terms. We argue for marriage. We can't just say the Bible teaches. No, we've got to give arguments from sociology, from history, from civilization, powerful arguments for why this is the wisest way, and so on. We need to be persuasive. Those are problems of public life. But the real problems are, in the church, sadly.
Thank you so much for coming tonight.
My privilege.
My question is, we're talking within here today, but when we look without, you look at Syria and Egypt, and they're having their own revolutions and unrest there. Would the framers have taken, and as again, you say they weren't looking at those boundaries because there was a 3,000-mile, ocean there. So they weren't looking based on region, but how would they have viewed intervention? I mean, would they have taken a jingoistic view, or would they have taken a view of more that we need to be advancing freedom in other places? What do you think our framers?
Yeah, you need to bring in a bona fide historian to answer that properly. Clearly, they were aware of what they called entangling alliances and interventions. They were leery of that. But of course, one, the US then was not the lead society in the world. And today, it is. And two, they were not in a global world that was interconnected everywhere. And those two factors, among many others, put us in a very, very different situation. But I think they were, on the whole, very wary of entangling alliances.
Thank you for your talk. My question is, if we allow religion to be relegated and not in the public square, how long can the virtuous pagan sustain freedom, and for how many generations?
Great question. The real answer is God only knows. But no, the serious point is, America today is increasingly a cut flower civilization. A cut flower. I tell the story often, I was in Shanghai a number of years ago, and I was at a Marxist conference for CEOs, and at the end of it, I walked back from the dean of the business school to the lecture hall, and the dean said to me, "Can I ask you a question I wouldn't ask in public?" He said, "We in China are fascinated with the Christian roots of the Western past for the sake of China's future." Where did reforms come from? Where did compassion come from? Where did universities and science and these things come from? But he said, you in the West are cutting off your roots. What am I missing? We are more and more a cut flower civilization. So we've got to watch with sadness, but we've got to make this part of our prophetic apologetic argument. For example, when I was a student in the 60s, I knew Bertrand Russell. You know, people like Julian Huxley were around in those days. No secular humanist would ever have denied human dignity. Now, they would have argued they defended it and have the grounds for it just as much as Jews and Christians did. But now, 50 years later, not so. So, take dignity. Steven Pinker at Harvard, the uselessness of dignity. Someone else, the stupidity of dignity. You know, or take freedom. Sam Harris, the new atheist, freedom is an illusion. On the atheist grounds, you cannot ground a high view of dignity. You cannot ground a high view, or any view, of freedom. In other words, more and more these things are starting to show through. And eventually, they will affect the whole country and people will wake up. Now, we should be prophetic voices now, so that they see it before it's too late. But you're absolutely right. You cut the flowers, put them in a vase, and they die. It's as simple as that.
Last question.
Isaac.
You had stated at the end that the next generation will be quite pivotal, but what should we do?
I won't say God only knows. No. I was telling them this afternoon, I was at Stanford a few years ago, and a student asked me, if you could be a member of any generation except your own, which would you choose? I'd never been asked that before. All sorts of answers flashed through my mind, from Pericles and Trajan to William Pitt and William Wilberforce, and of course the 18th century with your founders, all sorts of generations, fascinating. But what came to me, actually, their generation. Because kids who are now a little older than your 11-year-olds, but who are rising to adulthood now, they are described as the crunch generation. In the sense that in the global era, you see a massive convergence of all sorts of trends: economic, environmental, nuclear, technological, transhuman, all this sort of stuff. So the next generation, Isaac, your generation, you're going to have to answer some of these trends and the challenges they create. If you answer them well, humanity's in for some good sailing. If you don't answer them well, or you don't answer them at all by drift, humanity's in profound trouble. So this is the crunch generation. And the challenge to people of faith, to Christians, is this: we have a record second to none fighting evil. Think of all the great reform movements, from infanticide to abolition of slavery to civil rights. Almost all the great reform movements in the West were pioneered by people of faith with a vision of Christ at their heart. We're great at that. But the challenges to come, the future of capitalism, and some of the huge issues, they're more abstract, although they're just as titanic. And we need Christians who dare to get into these complex issues and, by God's grace, work out answers. My own passionate concern is one of the little issues is, how do we live with deep differences? That's why I always keep coming back to that, which is my latest book that Cherie mentioned, The Global Public Square. How do we live with deep differences? That issue underlies all the other issues. We'll never figure out how to go forward if we don't know how to live with our differences. And people of faith have got to work out the answers to these and stand constructively for solutions that are creative for the future in tomorrow's world. That's the challenge. Thank you. Thank you very much.
so much, Oz. That was inspiring and provocative, as we knew it would be. I should let you all know that Oz will be right outside when we conclude here, just momentarily. There'll be a book table where you can buy either of his two latest books, The Global Public Square or A Free People's Suicide. We would commend them highly to you. They are really tremendous reads, and Oz will be right out there to sign any books that you have. You should also find, each of you on your seat, an invitation to join the Trinity Forum Society. And I hope you'll avail yourself of that invitation. The Society is really part of what makes events like this possible. And as part of the benefit of membership, one receives our readings, which come out quarterly, which provide a classic piece of literature or letters, which are really made for reading groups and discussions as well as individual use, as well as invitations to events like this. So as a special incentive tonight, we will give you a copy of your Os Guinness book of your choice, just to sweeten that, but invite you to join us as part of that and hope that you will join us. In addition, I should announce that it was just last spring that we launched our first event here in partnership with MBA in St. Paul's. We've really just been delighted by the interest and the turnout, having a sold-out crowd tonight. And so I'm excited to announce our next event, which will be held on April 1st. Yes, April Fool's Day, but it really is happening. In this very auditorium, the Dead Poets Society Auditorium, where we will be hearing from a renowned and very much alive poet named Dana Gioia. Many of you perhaps are familiar with Dana, really an extraordinary speaker as well as a senior fellow of ours, a poet with 4 different poetry collections, an opera librettist, a critic, an essayist, and the former chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, whom Business Week once credited with saving the NEA. So hope that you will turn out for that. It would be good if you are not already on our invitation list and are just here as a guest. Let us know tonight. My colleague, Margaret Eberly, who's standing in the back, will be available right outside, and you can sign up with her as well as give your Trinity Forum Society brochures to her as well. Also, if you would like to be involved with this event as a host or a sponsor, please see me or Margaret. We'd love to talk to you about that further. And I think it's appropriate to end with thanks, and certainly there are many people to thank tonight. Our sponsors and hosts who have helped make this possible: Joe and Judy Cook, Matt and Betty Dobson, John and Carol Rochford, Ridley and Irene Mills. And again, I just want to give special thanks to Byron Smith along with his wife, Beth. Byron is one of the few people who have not been up on the stage tonight, even though he has been extraordinarily and deeply involved in the behind-the-scenes work, really making this possible. And it's sort of a living testament to Ronald Reagan's statement that it is amazing what you can do when you don't care who gets the credit. So, Byron, thank you for that. Finally, I'll just thank again our partners, MBA and St. Paul's, along with the people on your team that helped make that possible: Jennifer Howell, Nancy Crow, Lisa Schlachter, and others. If I have forgotten you, my apologies. The student ambassadors and the volunteers, my very able and talented colleague, Margaret Eberly. Oz, thank you again. And for all of you, thank you for joining us, and good night.